back a little bit. Yeah. So this, you want to think about, there are really two types of errors that the FDA can make in their approval decisions. The first one we're all familiar with, the first error, is they can allow the drug, okay, and the drug is harmful. In statistics, it's what we call a type 1 error. And allowing a harmful drug has certain consequences. The victims are identifiable. They're traceable. Somebody harmed or a relative of somebody harmed by a bad drug can show up on Oprah, okay, tearfully. Okay, this is a very public event when a bad drug is allowed onto the market. Everyone knows about it. Because of this, there's a bias in our thinking and in the FDA thinking. I'll come back to that in a second. When we allow a bad drug, heads roll at the FDA. Okay? Somebody has made a mistake. There are hearings. Okay? You can put a face on the harm which has been done. That's type 1 error. Type 2 error is very different. Type 2 error is when the drug is beneficial, but the FDA does not approve it or delays its approval. Now, in this case, there may be very many victims. There may be thousands of people who die because a drug is not available which could have saved their lives. These victims, however, are faceless. We can identify them perhaps only in a statistical sense. When we compare, if we have a chance, if the drug is ever approved, we can say, look, this drug reduces the mortality rate by 5%. Had it been approved 1 year earlier, that's 5% more people who would have lived who in fact died. Okay? You can identify people, these victims, in a statistical sense, but it's very difficult to put a face on them. Because of the thousands of people who die, you don't know which ones would have lived. Okay? The victims may not even know that they're victims. Okay? As I mentioned, very few people, think about what kind of drugs are in the pipeline. Might this drug have saved my life or saved the life of a loved one? Not saved my life, but people wouldn't say that. But they might say saved the life of a loved one. Okay? Right. So this type of error, the type 2 error, doesn't result in heads rolling at the FDA because it's invisible. It's much harder to see, almost all of the time. Very few exceptions. In the late 1980s, the AIDS activists, for the very first time, the AIDS activists began to put some pressure on the FDA because of type 2 error. Happens very rarely, though. Type 2 error is in the back, is hard to see, much harder to see than type 1 error. So because of this, the FDA has a bias. The FDA has a bias in their thinking. They're much more worried about type 1 error than they are about type 2 error. They don't want type 1 error because that causes them problems. Type 2 error, nobody knows about. They can put under the rug. Nobody even cares, perhaps. It's hard to see, hard to understand. You need some theory to understand it. So the FDA is much more concerned with type 1 error, and because of that, is in effect too risk averse. They hold back too many good drugs. At least that is their incentive to hold back these hold back drugs. Okay? If they're going to make a mistake, they want a type 2 error, not a type 1 error. And because of that, even though both types of errors kill, both types of errors are very harmful. But the FDA only cares about one, so there's a bias. Okay? In fact, in one sense, type 2 errors are worse than type 1 errors. Because type 1 errors, precisely because we see when a drug is released onto the market, we see people who are injured. Okay? Because we see the injured, we can do something about it. Okay? We learn that this drug is not as good as we thought, or has some problems, or has to be used in a specific way. You learn, and the error becomes self-correcting. Okay? Type 2 error is not self-correcting at all. Right? You could have tens of thousands of people dying who would have lived had this drug been available. Nobody gets up in arms. Nobody learns what was going on. You see. If you had tens of thousands of people dying from a bad drug, that would instantly become known. So you could do something about it. Not true with type 2 error. So in many ways, type 2 error is actually more serious than type 1 error, but it's not acknowledged. Here, looking at FDA incentives is a nice quote. This is physician Henry Miller, who was former head of the FDA's Office of Biotechnology. He described the incentives inside the FDA, so this is Henry Miller speaking. He says, in the early 1980s, when I headed the team at the FDA that was reviewing the new drug application for recombinant human insulin, we were ready to recommend approval a mere 4 months after the application was submitted, at a time when the average NDA review was more than 2.5 years. With quintessential bureaucratic reasoning, my supervisor refused to sign off on the approval, even though he agreed that the data provided compelling evidence of the drug's safety and effectiveness. If anything goes wrong, he argued, think how bad it will look that we approved the drug so quickly. So that's very much how bureaucrats at the FDA think. And in one sense, I don't really blame them, okay? Because it's the public's bias as well. Okay? There is the seen and the unseen. The public sees the costs of type 1 error when a bad drug is approved. They don't see the costs of type 2 error when a good drug is failed to be approved or is delayed. Okay? So that bias in the public's mind generates these FDA incentives, which you see here. Lesson number 3. Costly clinical trials can make a product uneconomic to produce, even when the product would benefit patients. Okay? As I mentioned, there's no possible way the sensor pad could have ever made money had they had to do that extensive clinical trial. Okay? Had they done it, or had they not defied the FDA, it would have simply been the end of the product. Nobody would have bothered producing it. You just can't pay for it. This is also true of many pharmaceuticals. Okay? The more safety and efficacy trials which the FDA requires, and they've been requiring an increasing number over time, the more of these trials which the FDA requires, the fewer new drugs will be produced. It now costs over $800 million to produce the average new drug, close to $1 billion. A lot of money. What this means is if a drug has a small market, you can't possibly produce it. You can't possibly make enough money to justify the expense of going through all of those clinical trials. Clinical trials are very, very expensive. And the more expensive, the more trials we require, the fewer new drugs we will have. How many drugs are lost? Because costs are too much. Because it costs too much. Sam Peltzman, University of Chicago economist, was one of the first people to study this issue. And he looked at drug losses due to the 1962 increases in the FDA powers. Now, prior to 1962, the FDA had authority over safety only. Okay? They could require only safety trials for safety and not for efficacy. And as a result of that, the average time to approval for a new drug, in fact, the average research time and approval time, we were talking 1 or 2 years.